Hello, everyone. I'm your host, Andrea Weckerly, and welcome to the Ready Living podcast, where each episode is designed to educate, inspire, and empower you to create the life you want. My guest today is Dr. Dana Klisanin. She's an award-winning psychologist, futurist, and founder of Rewilding Lab. Recognized by the American Psychological Association for her pioneering contributions to media psychology and celebrated in Forbes as a top female futurist, Dr. Klisanin is a sought-after consultant for global organizations looking to develop resilient and adaptable leadership in the face of climate change and other existential risks. Her research on the anti-fragile mindset and rewilding the human psyche inspires readers to navigate difficult challenges, reclaim their wild imaginations, and live more creatively. She's the author of the Chronicles of Gaia science fiction series, and her artworks exploring human consciousness, nature, and technology have been exhibited internationally. Welcome, Dana.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here.
I want to jump right into it. Can you talk about what you mean by rewilding the human psyche?
It's about helping people reconnect with their creativity. When we think about rewilding, I often like to start off because people might not have any familiarity with the term rewilding, and it actually comes out of the conservation movement, and so those who are familiar with it know it as something involved with reclaiming and restoring landscapes that have been, destroyed over time.
Right.
And so what this is about is taking that same concept and saying, okay, what have we lost in conjunction with the natural world? So as the natural world is disappearing, what parts of ourselves have we lost along with that? And as we reclaim the natural landscape outside in the world, the outdoors, how can we do the same thing with our interior landscape? And so that's sort of what we mean by like rewilding the psyche.
Back in the 17th and 18th centuries in Europe, there was this division between mind and body, and there was a hyper focus on empiricism and rational thought. And that definitely allowed science to flourish, but it also resulted in us minimizing or discounting some of the other parts of us that make us human, namely emotion and intuition. Can rewilding get us back to that?
Yes, absolutely. Definitely, we had that loss that you spoke of, and the senses, our human senses, were sort of put on the side, and so things that you know, smelling, right? The sensation of smelling. That's a sensation that we as human beings have, but if it's sort of blocked, and things like movement. We ask our children to sit at desks all day long. We sit at desks all day long, but one way of knowing, originally for human beings, was through movement, was through other sensory organs, smell being one, and so forth. So yes, I think it is a bridge to bring these things together, and neuroscience is actually helping us understand that more and more. So these things were sidelined, and there's always been a group of people saying, no, these are important, indigenous ways of knowing are important. And now, of course, with neuroscience, we have imaging, and we can see just in what way these things are actually impacting the human body, mind, spirit, etc.
Your work also draws from sustainability and biophilic
Yeah.
principles. And I believe you said that Rewilding Lab includes forest bathing, doesn't it? I'm a big fan of forest bathing, which in Japanese I believe is called Shinrik Yoko.
Yes, absolutely. It does draw upon those areas. Sustainability, in particular, is a big focus. We want to support the natural world. We want to fight climate change. It's a very important topic. And so I feel like, at least personally, the work I do does come from a place of trying to do what I can do, what's in my power to support the restoration of the planet to full health. And I think that at Rewilding Lab, we do include forest bathing as one of our techniques to help people reconnect with nature. I mean, what better way than to be outside in nature? And that's another thing, in Japan, right? That can be prescribed as a healing modality. In the United States, thus far, that's not, let's say, something that someone can prescribe to you where it's insurance would pay for it. And there's many other things like that in other countries that, like social prescriptions for going to a museum or being social, that we don't have here, that will, I think, over in the future we will have. But for now, I mean, what better way to get in touch with the natural world than to actually be out in it?
What are some of the reasons you think these things haven't been as widely adopted in the United States as they have in other parts of the world?
Well, I definitely think Japan is ahead of us in this area. In Japan, it's a very strong work culture. And so people were working to the point of exhaustion, depression, and there were high suicide rates in Japan. And so the forest bathing was one approach to help, to give people something to do that would help alleviate the stress. There's not as much emphasis in our government on making sure that people have these sort of wellness protocols that support productivity.
I would love to have an approach that picks the best from different parts of the world and would be able to prescribe that for individuals, as you are mentioning, talking about how they can pursue mental health, physical health, and the interconnection between those two. I think that's really important.
Yeah, maybe one day we'll get there in this country.
What inspired you to get involved in this type of work?
That's a wonderful question, and it is a kind of a confluence of things. But I'll have to say that what really tipped me over into exploring rewilding of the human psyche was actually retreat that I did, or a workshop, you might say, hosted by Kings North and Carolyn Ross. And it was held on Sherkin Island in Ireland. And it was called Rewild Your Words. And I write as my pastime. So I was interested in that approach, and I thought, I'm going to do this course. And so I signed up for it. And, it was really wonderful. It just made me think about not only rewilding my words, but how many other people were missing this sort of experience and how it might inform not just your writing, but anything else that you were doing in life. And in fact, just your entire lived experience. And I might not have done anything with it per se, except COVID happened almost right afterward. And at that time, I started doing research on the anti-fragile mindset. And I found that one of the components of that anti-fragility or anti-fragile mindset was, or one of the healing modalities that I sort of observed, was people spending time in the natural world outside, right? We
Right,
did a
right.
lot of that during COVID. And so that research led me deeper and deeper into this rewilding, and that's how I arrived.
I'm always curious what brings people to the work that they are so passionate about and that they devote so much of their life to. And there's usually an interesting story behind it, such as yours. I want to shift slightly to a discussion about how people can best navigate and withstand change, specifically change that might be difficult or frightening. You wrote a paper called Existential Risk from Resilience to Antifragility, published in the Proceedings of the Stanford Existential Risks Conference 2023. And you talk about global catastrophic risks and their capacity to trigger cascading global crises. These crises, and in turn, can have an enormous psychological impact on people. What are some examples for those folks listening of global catastrophic risks, and why do cascading global crises compared to, let's say, isolated disasters pose such serious threats to the human psyche?
Examples of these risks are things like what we've just been through. So the pandemic, climate change, nuclear war. And the reason that these pose a greater challenge than, let's say, an isolated disaster is because they have interdependent features. Let's let's take the pandemic, for example. It wasn't just a matter of people getting sick and, let's say, dying from COVID. It was a matter of transportation shutting down. And when transportation shut down, that impacted the ability to receive basic supplies like food, medicine, and it also impacted employment. And so people lost jobs. It impacted education. There's still children who are making up for losses from, moving to online education. That's why a cascading global challenge or crisis is worse than an isolated disaster.
In your paper, you also mentioned pre, peri, and post disaster risk factors. How do pre existing mental health issues, gender, age, and socioeconomic status interact to increase vulnerability to mental health problems during and after disasters?
The research showed that people who already had a mental health issue or challenge fared worse after a disaster, right? So anyone who already has a diagnosis with mental health is likely to have a worse outcome in the case of one of these disasters. And also, the research shows that women are more vulnerable and children are more vulnerable to worse outcomes, as well as people who are in a lower socioeconomic standard have worse outcomes. And some of these are probably more logical, like you can understand, well, if someone doesn't already have access to resources, then after a disaster, they're even less likely to have access to these resources. And with women, already 1 in 3 women have suffered either domestic violence or rape. And so, sort of by definition, they already have a heightened psychological risk factor because they've already been through a challenging situation. Those are some of the factors that can lead to worse outcomes for those populations.
In your work, you also talk about the concept of antifragility and how it differs from resilience, and why you believe the traditional concept of resilience is insufficient to address the psychological challenges we're facing today. How can we develop antifragility as a complete response framework?
The reason that I think resilience is insufficient in the face of these kind of cascading global challenges is because resilience is kind of predicated on bouncing back, getting where we were, getting back to normal. And in cases such as we've been discussing, it's often impossible to get back to a state of normal. Normal may have totally disappeared. And so that's where anti-fragility comes in. And that's whatever got me thinking about it is Taleb, who is the author of the book Anti-Fragility. He explains anti-fragility as growing stronger in the face of trauma and challenges. And we do have in psychology something called post-traumatic growth. It's just not as talked about as PTSD. And I thought, this is a very interesting concept if we apply it to psychology. And the way I see it now, or the way I talked about it or explored it in that paper that you referenced, is as a sort of a spectrum, so that we have, let's say, a psychological spectrum, a revising of the spectrum. So instead of having, like, let's say, extreme fragility on one end and resilience as the top response on the other end, that we sort of move resilience to the middle as the middle response, psychological response. And then we position anti-fragility directly opposite as the top response we might have in the face of trauma. Grief is natural to us. It is part of our human experience. And so I think it would be wrong to put it out there to say that, okay, in the face of trauma, you should just grow stronger. And that's not realistic. But it's not realistic to say that you can't, because we have evidence to say that you can. And so I think the most realistic framework is one that would say, you could actually experience all of these things, maybe not simultaneously, but that within a window of time, which would be unique for each individual. Because again, we're talking about this in terms of a really big crisis in the world. In any one individual's life, the loss of a loved one is a tremendous crisis. However, if you were in the state of a nuclear war, or if the cascading crisis of climate change continues and we see a breakdown of everything around us, right? That's something that we as human beings aren't necessarily accustomed to. So if we create and we talk about this ability of anti-fragility, then when such crisis appears in our lives or in society, we may then have something to draw upon beyond resilience. And that the point is, we might struggle through grief and resilient and get to resiliency and then get to anti-fragility. And it may not be we move from one to the next in a linear pathway, but it's a more circuitous, circular thing that goes on in our psyche. And just the fact to know that it's possible already gives us an advantage psychologically.
I'm wondering if this ties into the next thing, namely neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to create new neurons and build new networks in response to life experiences, or what some people call rewiring the brain. What about someone who has already experienced trauma, right? How can they use these ideas of the anti-fragile mindset to begin their healing process? Is that possible?
Yes, I think that the first thing, yes, is to know that it's possible, to know that we can rewire and that we can learn new responses. In the anti-fragile mindset research, I found that character strengths and virtues from the positive psychology research were very important. In other words, people had a heightened reliance on character strength during the pandemic than they typically do. So I would suggest, to someone, I would say, build up your character strengths, find the ones that more significant to you. You don't have to have all of them. You just have to have some that help you. And then back to what we talked about earlier on, the natural world. I believe spending time outside, turning to the natural world, and not just like walk. Certainly being outside and walking around is already healing. We have evidence to show that just the scent of the trees is healing. Just bird song is healing, lowers stress and blood pressure and things like that. What I would like to transmit to other people is to actually build a relationship with the natural world, because that's what's one of the things that's so broken. We just are socialized to think of it as something that is there to serve us, something we use, and we don't often think about actually having a relationship. And if we had a relationship with the natural world and we recognized our real interdependence on it, then I really feel like you can't help but to love it. Right? You build sort of a love relationship when you recognize that you're breathing because a tree is providing you what you need to survive. Then you think about it differently, and maybe you walk through the forest in a different way. And so I think that anyone struggling with trauma should consider building that type of relationship. Another thing that I found during the research was adjusting your personal narrative, maybe working with either a therapist, a coach, or someone to help you reframe things, because that's important.
I want to ask you about hope and courage, because I think those are woven into the work that you do. What role do you think these two things play in the ability to face some of the challenges that we've been talking about?
I mean, I would say they're pretty essential. I think you pinpointed two really important qualities there. Hope. I mean, if you lose hope, then you're really lost, because that's sometimes all you do have to go on if everything around you is destroyed. And courage. I mean, during COVID, some of the research showed, that was really helping people to get through, was courage. So, yeah, I would just say that those are pivotal and that people should build them up in their repertoire of character strengths.
Yeah, I totally agree. And your earlier work focused on digital altruism and digital heroism. So when I think of everyday altruism, I think of things like picking up trash at a park, volunteering at a local nonprofit, or making donations to worthy causes, or returning a lost item to its owner. But there are, of course, also higher stakes situations like stepping in to help someone in need of emergency help, or putting your own safety at risk to help another person. What's your definition of altruism? How does digital altruism expand on that? And what role do digital heroism and cyber heroes play in this?
When I started that research many years ago at this point. I was in humanistic, transpersonal, and what we now talk about as positive psychology. And I was always looking for higher functioning of people. And on in the online world, there was a lot of research on cyberbullying. I just was naturally drawn to say, well, what positive things are going on online? And that's what drew me to the research. And so altruism to me, I think my definition is probably pretty similar to yours. It, could be something as simple as helping someone cross the street, could be an altruistic act. It's just taking time out from your pursuit of your day to do something for someone else. It's a little bit different than generosity, which is usually considered, let's say, donating money to someone. That's being generous. It's also can be all thought of as altruistic, but we do have some different terms for these various areas. And so when you apply like helping someone cross the street as sort of a broad general definition for altruism, and you take that into the online world, then what I was seeing online at that time, and again, this is many years ago, was just simple things like they clicked on a link, it might provide food for someone. There was a rice one. You ask a few questions and then it would add up to grains of rice, and these would be shipped to people. Since that time, of course, as the way of the world is, a lot of advertisers and people jumped on this as a way to get people's information. It's now become a little dicey of an area, but in the beginning, it wasn't so much. Anyway, there was Care2 network, and there was many other networks where people could help other people, and even web searches. If you use a certain web search, it would help other. Well, anyway, those were the kind of examples of things that fell under what I term digital altruism. And when I was doing that research, I just noticed that there were some people who were doing this really often. Every single day, they would go on and they would do what they could do digitally to help other people, animals, and the environment. And so I started to think, well, is this a new form, or could we expand our thinking that this could be a new form of heroism? Because then your intention is almost like a heroic intention to save acres of rainforest and so forth. That's where sort of heroism came into it. And then as the years went by and mobile phones became dominant, collaborative heroism comes in. So that's sort of the far end of the research, or at least where I stopped researching it for now. So, the climate marches, for example, when people are marching in the streets in real time, but they're also simultaneously posting online, sharing on social media. So then you have this confluence of the digital world and the in-person world coming together in sort of this third space that's more impactful, because as we know, the internet expands things exponentially. With the cyber hero archetype, it's sort of a blending together of the superhero archetype and the hero archetype. And the reason that I say that is because the internet gives people like a digital cape, right? We are able to transmit information instantaneously, the same way that, let's say, Superman was able to fly somewhere instantly. As much as people might think that's a strange person to choose, I think that, Greta Thunberg is a good example, because I mean, her whole story started largely because she went to protest, and her protest sign sitting there got spread on social media,
Right.
right? And so she became known because social media spread her story around. And then she also availed herself of this technology to spread Fridays for Future movement around and then create the large marches. So, in a way, she sort of is a good example of the use of this technology, in her case, for protecting the environment.
Great example. She's really made a huge difference, especially among young people, letting them see that young people can make a positive difference, and pulling in political leaders and our leaders of industry and looking to them for leadership as well, and saying, wait a minute, we need you to take action here.
Well, and definitely she's availed herself of this technology. And, years past, a young person would not have ever been able to make the kind of impact that she was able to make. And she was able to do it because, she had access to these, tools.
Before we move on, I want to tell all the listeners out there that if you're enjoying today's Ready Living podcast episode, you can send an email with the subject line podcast to team@readywhenstuffhappens.com, and I'll make sure you're notified as soon as future episodes drop. So, we were just talking about technology a little bit, and technology obviously plays a big role in everyday life. Are there any technological advancements that you believe will help, for example, artificial intelligence?
I wish I were a little bit more positive about artificial intelligence right now, but I'm concerned about the rapid advancement of artificial intelligence into artificial general intelligence and then artificial super intelligence. And I do believe that currently the basis of AI has a lot of positive benefits, and that if human beings just had positive aims in life, right, that we could use it to probably solve just about all of our problems. However, because of the competing ideologies and because of governments being at odds with other governments and the war machine and so forth, I have a tendency to just be not that optimistic about technology right this minute. And I hope my opinion changes. I will say, because I do like to focus on the positive and not on AI particularly, but I will say that I think that one of the best uses that listeners might have of technology, again, not AI technology per se, but just things like using biofeedback. It's become far more affordable and easy for people to use biofeedback to learn about their brain state and their physiological responses to things. I think that's really wonderful, and that by availing themselves of that type of technology can increase their own well-being, mental and physical, using headbands that give you feedback, engaging in meditation. Because a lot of people, if they can't, let's say, work with someone in person, they might feel like they're not making progress in meditation. And so sometimes I think some technology can really help people and guide them and give them that kind of feedback and let them know, yes, I'm doing fine. And then they can see over time their stats, and that can inform and encourage them to stay with something like meditation. And certainly, I mean, one more thing to say, obviously, during the pandemic, our technology was a huge boon to all of us, right? We were able to continue working. We were able to let children do, have school. We still had our entertainment, in fact, right? And so, that's a positive use.
Well, you're also the author of a series of books, and you wrote the book Future Hack, which came out in October of last year, which is the first installment in the Chronicles of Gaia series. It's about a group of young time traveling heroes who uncover a plot that threatens the Earth's future and embark on a series of missions to save the planet. By the way, I love the fact that you collaborated with the Neighborhood Forest Program this year for Earth Day, where every purchased copy of the book funded a tree for a child in the forest program. I was super excited to see that. Tell us about the book. As a project, it seems to pull from different aspects of your work, from your passion for connecting with and protecting the environment, helping people be heroes, and acting with the future in mind by ensuring that what we do today serves and protects future generations of humans and fellow Earthlings.
Thank you so much for bringing the book up. It was a passion project, and it does bring together a lot of my interests. I mentioned at the beginning that what led me into the rewilding work was actually writing as one of my pastimes. So I have been working on a couple of different books over the years in the fiction world, and this series was one that very close to my heart. And the reason is because I am concerned about young people learning about climate change, extinction of species, and being given very little resources at this time. Now, there's starting to be more conversation about eco anxiety. Anyway, the book was written to sort of address that, to give information to young people and empower them at the same time, to say, yes, this is real. Yes, you can make a difference. and to showcase young people that were tasked with those challenges, that I thought, that there was a certain readership out there who might really appreciate that and be able to see themselves in that group of young heroes.
Yeah, so I'm hoping school libraries and public libraries are heavily buying this book. And in fact, the second book in the Chronicles of Gaia series, Norbu's Secret, is coming out in October. Isn't that right?
Yes, that's right. And that one takes the children into the rainforest, and they're investigating the disappearance of the jaguars, and then they have a series of adventures, etc. But that one also dives more heavily into futurist thinking and what we mean by, anticipatory thinking. What I've tried to do is work some of the things that I've been interested in into a format that young people could become introduced to it. Because again, that's not something that most young people study foresight or these kind of concepts until they're much older, if ever. Sometimes it's introduced in college curriculums. And I just feel like it really belongs at a younger age point.
So, any of the parents, teachers, or librarians out there listening to this, go and buy these books. In fact, the second book would make a great early holiday gift. So, go out and buy those.
Thank you.
When somebody looks at your body of work, it's clear that you're aware of what's at stake and the challenges we collectively face. But your work also reflects an amazing level of optimism, which is infectious. What excites you the most about the future?
Youth, the young people excite me the most because I think that they have the domineering spirit and that they're not going to just let everything disappear around them. I'm very hopeful that they'll use the new technologies to find solutions to some of these challenges. I think there's just an immense amount of creativity out there. We just see young people getting savvier and savvier every generation. And I feel that's the biggest hope to me.
How can they get in touch with you?
The Rewilding Lab website is one place that they could, sign up to follow, join our newsletter or social media. I am on the regular places. I'm always happy to hear from anyone.
Dana, thank you so, so much for taking the time today. It's been really wonderful.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure. I really enjoyed our conversation.